In last week's episode, looking at Camus' book The Rebel, we'd been discussing how Camus looked at the branch of state terrorism that he called rational terror, by which he meant the communist government of the Soviet Union. And he'd also made the comment that in Marx's writings and thinkings there seemed to be two distinct branches, one of a kind of critical scientific analysis and another that he called a kind of prophetic branch. And the comment was made that in the Soviet Union in the mid-1930s, the Soviet government, which was in effect the kind of curator of all the works of Marx and Engels, had come to a point where they had stopped publishing a lot of work that hadn't yet been published, and apparently because they were uncomfortable about the increasingly prophetic or even kind of supernatural nature of some of Marx's writings. But Camus actually makes the comment that he thinks that Marx was introducing a religion of the divinity of man. And then he goes back to look at some of the earlier bourgeois theoreticians of earlier revolutions. He talks about people called de Maistre and Comte. And he says Comte wanted to see a religion of man which would be celebrated in Notre Dame Cathedral and which would involve a despotism with no rights for the individual. And de Maistre regarded all men as being united in the same spirit, and that all would be sacrificed on the altar in order to abolish evil. And I think perhaps Camus suggesting that there's some similarities in those ideas and what Marx was proposing and what Lenin and Stalin were later putting into practice. So he also goes on to say that the prophecy wasn't really fulfilled, partly in the sense that the workers' paradise, the worldwide workers' paradise and dictatorship of the proletariat wasn't realised, inasmuch as after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia there was no following similar revolution in Germany or France or England or America or on the worldwide basis. So it remained isolated, at least at that time, in Russia, although later on, of course, there were communist revolutions in China and places in Asia. But initially it was located just in that one country, and also Camus points out, which is well known, that even within Russia there was a lot of resistance to the plan, particularly amongst the peasants. And we know, of course, from the history of Russia that the serfs it had only been really 50 years since the serfs had been released more or less from a state of slavery. Although even then they were theoretically free and could move about and could purchase and own land, they were still kind of trapped in almost a worse kind of debt, slavery after that. But even so, at that point, having been released in 50 years or so, they were very reluctant to submit themselves to the communist dictatorship. So by no means was the workers' paradise achieved, even in Russia itself. So Camus actually kind of steps back a bit then to look at some of the earlier revolutions again and to examine some of the changes that take place. And he makes the statement, when aristocracy fails, those concerned for the heart of civilization look for a new elite, and a new reserve elite arises. So I suppose if you're thinking of the French Revolution, then of course the king and the aristocracy were overthrown, and a new kind of middle class, I suppose intellectual, educated elite took over power. And in the Russian Revolution, of course, the Tsar and the aristocracy were overthrown, and I suppose the Bolsheviks really took over, who were these kind of professional revolutionaries. So I think that's recognised that when a king, a monarchy or an aristocracy is depose, then some other group takes over, which is some new elite. And I think we come to realise that more and more as time's gone on. Camus says that those who are concerned for the heart of civilization are this new elite that comes into play. So just from my own point of view, I don't know that I'd agree with. I think we've come to realise that new elites do emerge, but I think sometimes they're not really perhaps concerned so much for the heart of civilization, but more for what they can get out of it themselves, really. And again, this is not Camus saying this, but I think even if we look at the American Revolution, which was really the first of all these ones, it happened before the French Revolution. It seems as though it was really a group of Englishmen and Scotsmen living in one of the English colonies that decided that they no longer wanted to be governed by the King of England, but they wanted to be the rulers of this new country, and they staged the revolution. And of course there were admirable principles expounded in their constitution and their declaration about democracy and freedom of expression and liberty and all those sorts of things. But in practice a new elite was taking control, and perhaps they've been in control ever since. And it's interesting that almost all of the American revolutionary leaders were Freemasons, and I think some, and the revolution itself took place in that auspicious year of 1776 when the Illuminati organisation was established, really. So perhaps one could even, and again this is not Camus saying, this is just my musings, but perhaps one could almost see the United States as being the first Freemasonic state, in the same way that the USSR was the first Marxist state. Anyway, so Camus, getting back to Camus, he acknowledges that some new elite will always take over when this revolution occurs, when the ruling class is overthrown. Whether that turns out to be good or bad, I guess, is another matter. And then he also talks about the blocks that emerge. So the book The Rebel was written in the early 1950s, so the Cold War was already underway, so the world had largely divided up into the communist Soviet bloc anyway, and the Western American, Western European, what one might optimistically call democratic and capitalist bloc. And so Camus sees that as another frustration to achieving the kind of Marxist paradise, because both of those two blocs, aiming to survive and be strong in themselves, and particularly involved in competition with the other, have to maintain a strong economy, have to maintain high levels of production. So he says the need to maintain that high level of production will often involve a degree of repression and even slavery. And he also says that with both of those opposing blocs, they may be based on what he calls a supposed formal virtue or on an established cynicism. So I suppose that you could apply that to either side, really. If he's in fact talking about the communist bloc and the free world capitalist bloc, both of them could claim to have some ideology for maintaining the lifestyle and the economy and the way of life that they are wanting to have. But at the same time, there's a cynical desire just to for oneself to get rich. And I think I think Camus is suggesting that that could be applied equally to either of those two blocks, and I think probably we would sort of accept that that's really the case now. So then Camus returns to the idea that Marx's thought includes kind of a critical analysis and this prophetic element. And the critical analysis includes a kind of an analysis of history. But then Camus points out if one is scientifically examining and analysing history, one can only really do that by looking at the past, because future history hasn't happened yet. If one's going to try and analyse future history, then again one's moving in the realm of the prophetic. And he also says that the Marxian idea seems to see an end point. This workers' paradise, this dictatorship of the proletariat, once that's realised, then history will have achieved its final end point. But if that's the point, then if that's the case, then does that mean that the dialectic has been stopped? So we've mentioned in the last few weeks the dialectic of Hegel, which Marx adopted, which means that you're continually moving forward by successive compromises to some distant endpoint that you haven't really quite understood or envisaged. So if history is going to end with this Marxist paradise, then has one consciously stopped the dialectic and said, we've had enough, now we're going to turn it off? He says the nihilist couldn't accept that, because a nihilist would always want to be breaking that down, even that step, eliminating that, and then moving on to the next step. And one can never really achieve an end point. And one shouldn't even ever want to, really. And so here, there's this comment again, quotation, nihilism is an absolutist movement which aims at denying everything which is not itself. I'm not really quite sure what that means, actually.